What up, everyone? Pat Mayo here. I've gathered up a collection of interviews with people from around the fantasy industry, plus other people I just think have cool jobs to tell you their story and how their background got them to where they are today and how they've used those experiences in the past. It's called The Grind, a brand new series produced by the Pat Mayo Experience. Enjoy.
The Pat Mayo Experience.
Pat Mayo Experience. Pat Mayo Experience. Pat Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, a special version of the Pat Mayo Experience. We're getting behind the scenes a little bit and trying to figure out how people get into the industry, tell their stories. So joining me in studio now with DailyRoto.com, it's Colin Drew. What's going on, man?
Hey, not too much.
And not just DailyRoto.com, it's SportsGrid and my old company.
Yes. So I'm doing marketing and product stuff for SportsGrid now, which owns Fantasy Sports Network and Daily Roto, Roto Experts, and esports business as well. So it's been an interesting 6 months for me. I was trying to think how long it's been. 6 months and 6 years at the same time.
It goes fast.
Yeah, it definitely flies by. But I've been at Daily Roto for a while before that. Even when I had a different job, I was still doing some freelance fantasy writing for them around hockey and golf. And I was interesting kind of path that led me to working there, and just a nice way to kind of get my foot in the door.
So let's backtrack from that a little bit. You say you're from DC, or you just live in DC?
I guess now I'm from DC. I grew up in New Hampshire, but I went to college in Virginia, and then I moved to DC out after college. So I've been there for 10 years now. So feels like home now, I guess.
So, I mean, you do a bit of golf, you do the hockey. Like, were you into hockey growing up? Is that how?
Yeah, I played hockey growing up, and the town I grew up in is where Dartmouth College was. So I'd always go to the college hockey games as a kid, and definitely was a big fan. But I like fantasy for hockey, like season-long fantasy and managing waiver wires and stuff. Like I don't like any of that stuff. So I didn't really get into fantasy hockey until DFS came along.
It's funny because the first exposure that I had to fantasy would be like going to the bar with my dad in like the early 90s, and they would run hockey pools, and the only thing that you could get were goals and assists. So that was the entire league. So you'd sit there and you'd draft players, and whoever had the most points by the end of the year, that would be it. Or there'd be a newspaper thing where they would give you blocks of 5 players. So it'd be like 20 blocks of 5 players, and you pick one player from each box, and that would be your team. You couldn't trade, you couldn't do anything like that. Just who had the overall total by the end. But I feel like it almost like hooked me. Like I was like, I get this. I get how this works.
Yeah.
I can figure this out going forward. And it didn't come around until like years later that I ended up doing this. But did you have exposure to fantasy at any level, whether it be baseball, football, at an earlier age?
Yeah, I mean, I had played like fantasy football most of my life. Starting in, I guess, in high school is when I started to get into that. And I did some of the fantasy hockey leagues with my friends. It just wasn't something I devoted like a ton of time to. And I'd say really like when DFS started was when I got like really into fantasy and reached out to Drew Dinkmeyer and Mike Leone, who were the owners of Daily Roto at the time, and just kind of sent him a note and was like, hey, I'd like to write about fantasy hockey. Like, I think I'm pretty good. Here are my results. But I also do this professionally, and like, I think you guys have an interesting business, and I'd be interested in kind of just talking to you guys about that, and if there's anything I can do to help out there. So I think that was one of the reasons. Like, at that time, there wasn't even a hockey product on Daily Roto. It was just free articles. Like, Drew and Mike aren't really hockey guys. I don't think they particularly like cared too much about like what my writing style was going to be like.
But you have picks that aren't bad.
Yeah,
we'll use you.
I wasn't bad, and I think just being able to offer them something different. And then they got a bunch of writing submissions for people who wanted to write about hockey, but because at that time I had been working in the tech space for Living Social, which was a really well-funded startup and a former unicorn. And I think I kind of had like a little bit of a different perspective. And I think that's one of the ways that I think people can get into fantasy who aren't doing it currently is, yeah, I think you have to be able to talk and write about fantasy, but I think also thinking of kind of other ways that you can help out the people you're writing for is something that really gets their attention.
Well, let's talk about the other side of this. So you were working at a company and you went to Virginia for college. Why Virginia?
I wanted to get out of like the Northeast. I'd lived there my whole life. I didn't want to go to the deep South. It's a little too southern for me. So I looked at a bunch of schools in the Mid-Atlantic, and like Richmond, where I went, had a good club hockey team. I wanted to keep playing club hockey in college just so I didn't go too far off the deep end.
So what did you take in college?
What for a major?
Yeah.
I was a accounting major.
Accounting major.
Oh, yeah.
I tried my hand at my mother's an accountant. So after I failed out from going to dental school, which is why I went to college to begin with, which is odd now in retrospect, I ended up going to business trying to focus on accounting. And I was big on financial accounting, not big on managerial accounting.
Yeah.
It was very, very boring from that sense. But do you think that, I mean, being on the accounting side, obviously you understand how the numbers work of actually making a business profitable and how to kind of clean up some of the inefficiencies. But do you think that's translated over to DFS a lot?
Like a little bit. I hated accounting too. It's so boring. But I think it was a good background just working with numbers as far as getting like a first job, which was in consulting. From there, though, I definitely think the kind of skills in business as far as like being able to pick up like Excel skills, working with numbers, like, and a bunch of people, you know, who have access to, you know, statistical programs and data viz stuff that it might be expensive to buy on your own, so you're never going to do it, but you learn it professionally, and then you think about how you can apply it to something that you're interested in, and it's just something you end up doing a lot of in your free time. So that's been like for sure been a big help as far as thinking about how to put together like hockey projections, for example.
So what were you doing with your other job?
So at Living Social, I ran sales operations. So we had, I guess, 900 or so salespeople at our biggest, and like my team was responsible for kind of figuring out what markets we should be selling in, how we're going to pay the salespeople, like whether we wanted phone salespeople or outside salespeople.
So it's decision making though. Like, what is the better decision at this time? I mean, that's
what roles are like producing the most profit.
But that's a skill that I feel does translate a little bit into being a successful player.
Yeah, and in a way, like in fantasy, and especially like DraftKings, you're working within the salary cap framework to try to produce the most results. Professionally, you have a limited budget. Like maybe we only have $50 million to spend on sales folks. And it's like, how would you want to go about allocating that amount of budget? Like what types of salespeople, how expensive are they? Or you want the big swing national sales guys? Or do you want the, you know, cold calling guys sitting in a basement, you know, making 300 dials?
Is it different working in like a tech type business? I mean, how long did you start working there after you left college?
So I started at Living Social 4 years after. I worked for a consulting company for my first 4 years, and I started.
Was that more of like an old business company versus like a tech company?
It was a little old business, but like we were working with government contractors, but it was always like commercial companies who wanted to work with the government for the first time. So like when Amazon was launching their web services, they would come to our firm and say, hey, we don't know how to work with the government. You know, go in and analyze all of our pricing and figure out like what, you know, we should charge the government for these different products.
Okay, so it was like half consulting, half like lobbying in a way.
It's like half consulting, half
half gouging.
A lot of regulation stuff, yeah, but a lot of the data work.
So when you go into something like a tech firm, like a newer tech firm, is there like a stylistic change in terms of the culture, the way that they ask you to work, what you should be thinking of?
Oh yeah, like the culture for sure different. Get rid of the suit and tie and throw on jeans and button down and a hoodie if you want. So that, from a cultural perspective, is definitely different. A lot more flexibility as far as the hours. Like I was working a lot, would work a lot of late nights, but like no one would look at you twice if you showed up at 9:30. Like that was fine because I was going to be there till 7:30 or 8. So
now, was that different from the other job where it's like, hey, it's 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or whatever?
Yeah, it was like if you're not there at 8:30, you're late. Like, and kind of
like
everyone leaves at 5:30, and like it's just, for me, that like is not as conducive to like a flexible lifestyle. Like, not that working late is always good, but if that's what it works with your schedule, then I definitely think people should be flexible.
And you can adapt around that too. Like that's what I found about ever since I started working in broadcasting. Broadcasting notoriously has really terrible hours. I would say that the suicide rates are up for dentists. Divorce rates for broadcasters are absolutely through the roof, especially sports broadcasting, because all sports happen at night. So the main amount of shifts, unfortunately, I do all my work like pre everything. It's like, hey, here are the picks coming up for this event that's happening in 2 days or on Sunday. Most people, at least in older broadcasting, have to wait for the games to be finished, put everything together, then broadcast about them. And all this stuff takes a lot of time. So their normal hours are like 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. It doesn't make for a good lifestyle.
And then Sundays too.
And then Sundays too. Weekends, holidays especially. Like you don't get them off because there's sports going on. That's what the people on their holiday are watching. So your job is still going all at the exact same time. So it's terrible, like lifestyle industry, but it seems to be working away from that now because of it's almost sort of the same thing where it's people can work their own hours now. People are okay from working from home. If you can work from home, hell, work from home kind of thing. Obviously, when you're being on camera, it's a bit different, but a lot of people that work in the sports industry now are probably just sitting on their couch.
Yeah, and I think that, so many people want to consume things on demand now. So they don't want to watch some stuff, obviously sports and things like that. You want to watch live, not after the fact. But most of the content I consume is now on demand. Like it needs to fit my schedule. Like I'm not going to work my schedule around watching a show. But that also creates flexibility for the content creators because you can push it to all the different channels where people can download things to their phone and watch it when they want versus having to consume it live, which I think is nice.
And I think it makes makes the creators far more comfortable too. Like if I say that, like, hey, I don't want to wake up at 6 a.m. to come in to film something at 7, like there's no time demand on that. I can film at 11, and when I feel better and I feel more comfortable, and you can pick to whatever. You don't need to listen to it at noon. You can listen to it the next day at 7 p.m. if you wanted to.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've always thought you do a really good job on for content is delivering it kind of when it's relevant and being one of the first people to get stuff out there. And
it makes me wrong very often though, because I'm not dealing with the same sort of information that's been released yet. I have to dig up my own. I'm not the greatest researcher.
Yeah.
I'm okay, not great at it.
You're setting the tone for the week though, influencing everybody else who's creating it later in the week. So it's definitely tough because you're not going to have all the news. You don't have as much time to digest it, but I think that people they want to be able to listen to it whenever they want, and so the earlier you get it out there, the more flexibility they have,
and the more
numbers you get.
And the more it kind of builds up. When they search it in Google, it ends up just a bit higher if it was released on a Monday as opposed to a Tuesday night. You're going to build up those hits and build up that SEO value.
Yeah, that's one of the tough things for daily fantasy that we are
it's daily.
working. It's daily, but then also trying to figure out. So for NBA, for example, people want things early so they can listen to it on their time.
But it's only really relevant for the last hour before lock.
Yeah, so it's like, what's the balance where you can produce content that is relevant but still timely enough? And like, how do you kind of sacrifice like the quality, get it out early, or increase the quality, but give customers like a shorter time range to digest it? So it's something we're going to be testing out over the next 6 weeks or so, is different mechanisms just to see how they work with like our customers.
Well, I made a conscious decision a long time ago that I would do football, I would do golf, and I would dabble in MMA solely because
Beautiful.
Those sports get 3 days of shelf life and the other ones just don't. Like if you're dealing with MLB or you're dealing with basketball and even hockey to a certain extent, basketball, if someone gets scratched 10 minutes to go, it changes the entire slate as it pertains to DraftKings. So you would almost need to be live from 6 to 7 every night. And that's when all the decision making comes in. Like if you're talking about baseball, you could do something right after the game's end or right when the prices come out, but you would need something like an addendum to put onto that later in the day for people to consume because, all of a sudden that guy's not playing. That changes everything. And I feel like that's the really difficult part when it comes to daily fantasy media for the sports that happen every night. I just took the easy way out and took the ones that don't happen until 4 days from now.
Yeah, and it's definitely something that's interesting, and especially depending on kind of how, like what the revenue model is, or what the goal for producing the media is. Obviously, for us, like at Daily Roto, a lot of it's subscription. So the SEO value certainly matters, but if it's a premium piece, anyways, like that's not the point of that piece. The point is to provide the content for our customers. Whereas, like, if you're producing a golf show, like,
or fantasy football rankings,
or anything like, you definitely want that stuff to be out there for as long as you possibly can have it.
So when was the first time that you played daily fantasy? Do you remember?
I was trying to think back. I don't remember. It was, well,
you remember what sport it was?
It was definitely football. It's probably 4 years ago at this point.
So when did you play your first hockey contest?
In my first hockey contest, I for sure played my first hockey contest like opening night of whatever
year it was.
Yeah, just because I think Draft Street was probably the first who DraftKings ended up buying, but that was probably the first site that I ended up playing on, which maybe it's Matt Berry. Maybe he's the one who brought me there.
It's funny how a lot of the people that got people into daily fantasy were some of the bigger names in fantasy at the time, yet have no correlation to daily fantasy like today. Like Matthew Berry can get people into it, but it's not like he's hyping daily fantasy all the time.
Yeah, he's not hardly at all. He mentions it a little bit in his articles now, but a lot of times it's not site specific. And yeah, definitely bigger. Like daily fantasy has created its own kind of personalities. I think that's been something that's an interesting trend to see happen.
It's a weird space for personalities too, because you're getting people. It seems like everyone shares a similar background. Because I'm terrible at daily fantasy, so this is why I'm probably not good at it, but there's a financial background. There's a data analysis background with a lot of these high-end players, and even a lot of the people that became voices doing it. Like, look at Drew's background, look at Mike's background, even if you look at like Tommy's background. I mean, the guy trades stocks for a living. Like, they understand numbers in a way that I feel like a lot of people don't, and don't realize that they do either.
Yeah, I definitely think that for fantasy players, that seems like it's one of the things that a lot of the strong players share as a trait. It's interesting. One of the things I think about a lot is just the different ways that you can kind of grow within the industry. I know one of the things that I listened to your show the other week that you were talking about a lot is like wanting all of your content to be free so you can build up your brand and be able to kind of have like a reputation and like touch kind of more customers than you would if it was behind a paywall where you're kind of naturally restricting things.
I always like to equate it to the show Lost. So Lost is very popular. Great first episode. Everyone sees it. But after episode 1 of Lost, it had zero chance of ever gaining more viewers than it had on night 1. Because it got progressively harder and harder and harder to follow along. It's not like you're going to pop up in the middle of season 3 and be like, I like this Lost. I saw a Lost episode. I'm all in. This is great. It only could go downhill from the beginning of it all. And I feel like that could be a problem with premium products too. Like you spike a bit and then you stay level for a while. And then what's the big X factor in growing that product? It's marketing, but how do you market it without anything that's free?
Yeah, and I think there's some of that. I think, for me, one of the things that I was thinking about, and I think a different path kind of than, going with the free kind of where you're building stuff up is to work for one of the smaller sites and be able to, do it and build like really close relationships. And so that's how I ended up with like a full-time job in fantasy, is because I was writing for hockey, but I really got to know Drew and Mike over kind of a long 2-year period. And so as they started to think about, hey, we really want to get someone, more responsible for driving the business side of Daily Roto and doing the marketing, like I already had a really great relationship with them. And so there's definitely a lot of kind of pros and cons as far as, a lot of times it's easier to kind of build up your brand or awareness if you're working at a bigger place, but you might not get to know some of the people that are in charge as well. So a lot of different paths.
Yeah, absolutely. But like the big thing for me with keeping things for free is, one, I don't really want to sell picks. Like I'm involved with Fantasy National, but they're one of the big things that I wanted with that site. There were no picks. You use that information. It's just data. The data can't really lie to you. You can lie to yourself about the data. The data's the data. You can choose to believe what you want and what you don't want to. And I run my stats every week and I look at it and be like, well, I don't really believe that one. And that's always the one that ends up winning, the one that I don't have. But I think that's really important because I never really wanted to sell picks. I'm just not good at making picks, so why would I sell them? I would feel if I give away picks for free and people tend to follow me on them, that's on you. Yeah. You watched a free show on the internet and you took some guy's picks. I try to make it sound like I'm well-reasoned. It's not like I'm just throwing them out there for nothing. There's research behind it. But eventually, I would feel if I wasn't winning and I was selling a product, I would, A, be fired very quickly. Everyone would turn on me, and just I don't need that kind of pressure.
And I definitely feel strongly that if people are, if information is behind a paywall, that the people
it should be good.
Should either be profitable or they should be transparent about whether or not they're not. Like, not everyone's going to win money every year. Like, there's a lot of things that could happen, but like people should be transparent about the success they are or are not having. So I definitely think that's one of the things that one of the reasons I trust Drew and Mike so much. But I also think we don't really view it as selling picks per se, and a lot of the stuff that we're doing is it's information. But it's also like customizable. So like you can see tools. All of the inputs, and it's tools for you to kind of tweak the inputs as you see fit. Obviously, our team, who's been successful in the past, is going to do their best job, and they're playing the projections in their lineups. So they're putting their money where the mouth is, so to speak. But you can still tweak things if we're wrong on a player, which we certainly are, then you can adjust the target share or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that stuff behind premium walls, the tools do need to be really good. Because, people will pay for ages. There would be the hotlines you could call for gambling picks. And even now, there's still sketchy dudes on the internet be like, hey, send me $20. I'll send you some picks for tonight. and they probably send out like one share of picks to half the people and the other side of the bet to the other half of the people, and then hey, half of them are winners.
Yeah, and like we're starting to test something with the NBA with a prop betting tool where we're basically taking like our projections and for because we spend a lot of time thinking about how basketball players are going to do, right? Like points, rebounds, assists, steals, all that kind of stuff.
Minutes are the big ones.
Are key, and that feeds into it. But then we can pull down the props from all the different sports books, and you can kind of see all these stats next to the prop. And like we're not necessarily making a recommendation on whether or not you should like bet that prop per se, but you can kind of have all that information there
and see the value. Is there value on this? Is that something that you're willing to do?
Yeah, and so I think that's like the area kind of in gambling that if it does become legalized in the U.S., that I could see us wanting to build out kind of tools and research tools and things like that versus the 1-800 number where someone's saying, bet the Jags plus 7.5.
Yeah, and then
lock of the century.
Yeah, and bet the Steelers minus 7.5. Lock of the century. Hey, and one person will believe it, the other person will go the other way, and hey, you hit one, you got a customer for
life. Happy customer.
You get one happy customer, one angry customer, and they won't come back. You have the repeat service from the other people.
Yeah. And then I think anyone who produces content is definitely aware that not everyone who uses it is like going to end up being profitable, but you're trying to put them in the best position to kind of...
I always try to describe it as I'm just giving you information. Here's what I would do with this information, but like sometimes I give out good information on the show and I fail to use that information to my benefit. Someone else does and they thank me. Or I give out really bad information that turns out to be right and they're like, hey, the bad information turned out to be all right. And then at halftime, it's just really bad ideas. But I'm not trying to tell you, here's what you should be doing, but here's the information in front of me. I've researched this. I'm not lying to you about the information. Do with it what you want.
Yeah, and I think the whole transparency thing is good. And like there's a role for different types of content. Some of it is supposed to be really accurate picks or projections.
Mine is supposed to be more fun than
Some
accurate.
is supposed to be really entertaining. And I think that your show is an entertainment show as much as it is purely analytics.
I would say it's a 99% entertainment show, 1% information.
Yeah.
That would be my ratio of it.
So I think that's a question that gets asked is like, if you're working in fantasy, do you have to be good at fantasy? And I think no. Like you have to be providing value. That value could be good at fantasy, or it could be a great entertainer.
Yeah, or even just be able to film something and put it to the internet. That's a skill that people aren't the best at.
Yeah, or it's hard to articulate things too. So there's a lot of good fantasy players who are total nerds and aren't good at articulating it on the video or podcast or whatever. And I mean, that's definitely something that I've struggled with in the past, is trying to, be comfortable like talking about all my ideas behind picks or whatever.
Well, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's go back to the beginning of hockey and everything. Like you do projections now, you do articles, you do podcasts, but I'm assuming that wasn't the case the first night that you had played DraftKings hockey.
Yeah, no, for sure not. I'm sure I just was clicking buttons and...
So what starts first? Like when you start your research from that point, you learn how the game works a little bit with hockey. What's the next step after that?
I think one of the things that for football, I would always lean on rankings or projections for my season long drafts. And like I started looking around for hockey and there just wasn't that much out there. And the stuff that was out there didn't seem good. And so it's like, oh, well, if there's not that much that's like great out there, then I know it helps me for all these other sports, and I kind of got to build it myself.
So how do you go about doing that? Obviously, you need to know how to use Excel, for one thing.
Yeah, and like you need to think about all the different stats and what goes into it. But I think one of the hardest things is figuring out like what is predictive and what's not. So for like a hockey example, like somebody who shoots at 10% in their career for a shooting percentage, all of a sudden is shooting at 30% this year. Like that's not going to be sustainable if they've shot 10% for the previous 5 seasons. So a lot of times if you're just trying to look at goals or something like that's not going to help you predict future goals. But if you're looking at shots and their shooting percent, that's something that can help you predict future goals.
So how long is it before you start playing into you building a model or projection system?
I think I maybe had one in my first couple months, but it was probably pretty bad, But
it's a start.
It's a start, and then you start figuring out things that you should be doing differently. Like, oh, I should be factoring in whether or not someone's, how much even strength or power play ice time they're getting. Like, I'm just projecting the total goals, but I should split it out. What if they get taken off the power play? And so you start building in some of that stuff over time, and but after a couple of years of doing it, you have a pretty decent system.
So you figure out what works, what doesn't work, what tends to be more predictive, or at least what works within your models for proper projection. So how long do you know that you're actually good at this? I mean, obviously you can see your bank account go up and up and up because you're winning, but how long did that take for you in hockey? Because hockey, like some of the smaller sports, you could see an incremental uptick very quickly as opposed to football where everyone's playing it. In hockey, there seems to be a very smaller community, and it's hard to even tell who's good and who's bad, at least at the outset.
Yeah, well, so when we first started, like there were a lot of people who were bad. People were playing goalies who weren't starting, and like things like that was happening like just a couple years ago.
It's like when I first started playing golf, probably like 5 years ago on DraftKings, like I was cleaning up. I think because I was like 1% of people who actually knew who all the players were.
So I was like, I don't even know if I'm good or if everyone else is just bad. And then like it starts to get tougher. Like those people stop playing the sport, or
then
they get
smarter
better
people move into the
information, smart
space.
people move in. So it definitely gets tougher every year. That's one of the things that like, oh, I know I was good last year, but like, does that mean I'm going to be good next year? Like, no, it doesn't always, but you hope it does.
So how long before you started producing content, written content about hockey?
It was probably like a year. I'd probably been playing for like a year. I had kind of a full season of results under my belt when I had reached out to them about it.
Why reach out? Why if you're winning playing, and this is a question that I always have for people like even Drew, even Mike, everyone. If you're winning playing daily fantasy, why be in the business of daily fantasy producing content? Now, I guess the easy answer is always it's stable income. If you're selling something, there is no variance night to night. You know what the paycheck coming in is, and you can still play on top of that. But like, why for you personally did you want to get into producing content?
Yeah, so for me personally, it like wasn't about the money at all. I don't even remember if I was getting $25 for an article or something like that. Like
Which is way more than most people at like season-long fantasy sites get paid, because most of those guys get paid nothing.
Yeah, and that was not. So it wasn't like a monetary decision.
It was
for
an
me.
ego thing. You wanted to...
I think I just enjoyed it.
Okay.
Like I enjoy like putting together the projections and stuff. I enjoy talking about fantasy, and so. But it's kind of boring to start your own blog and have no one read it. You have no followers, and so I was like, oh, I like to talk about this stuff, and this seems like a good platform. They seem like smart people. They seem like nice people. I could probably learn from them about the other sports, and so that was really what drove me. Was just my interest in doing it, like the same reason someone might blog about stuff for free.
So when you started writing, did you see an incremental increase in terms of the quality of your writing, like 6 months into it? Like how much were you writing before that at all?
No, I mean PowerPoint decks, right? Does
Yeah.
that count? I think my writing's gotten a little bit better. I think my editing definitely needed some work early on.
I always get into this because I've feuded with every editor that I've ever had, because especially like even when I moved from when I joined Roto Experts to begin with, they were following like APA format, like you need to structure your sentences this way. And after a while, it was just kind of like, no, I'm not going to write complete sentences. I'm going to use random capitalized words in the middle of sentences. Now that I've been over at DraftKings, the same issues have come up sort of thing. And I've more bent their way, they've bent a little bit my way to keep it readable.
That's like
the way that I find it. I don't want this to read like a tech manual.
Yeah, like that's kind of like a stylistic thing. Like I would get responses back from Adam Hummel that would just be like, dude, this could be like 4 paragraphs and you've written it all as one sentence. So it's like things like that.
Minor structural things in
Yeah.
terms of the readability of everything. But like, do you think like if you had to compare yourself today to the first one that you did, percentage-wise, how much better do you think you are?
I mean, I got to be at least 50% better than I was.
50%? I was going to say like 5,000% or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I'd say like for hockey, we do some writing, we do some podcasts and stuff too. I've definitely improved a lot as far as the ability to talk about hockey on the fly. I'd say one of the other things that I was worried about a little bit about whether you're going to lose edge by giving out your information or whatever. But if anything, I think it's I know in my results they've gotten better over time. And I think when you are putting together content and projections and being really thoughtful about it, like you're thinking a lot deeper about kind of every game, every night when you're producing content for other people. Whereas when you're just doing it for yourself, you might just be thinking about like the couple obvious spots that jump out. So I definitely think that, feeling like you're accountable for producing a good quality product has ended up making me more in tune with kind of what's going on and made me better at fantasy in general.
And I think that doing things like podcasting, I always it's one of the reasons I really like to do the Tuesday golf show. And I love doing the Wednesday DraftKings show. And I try to get good players on, like profitable players on to talk with me about sort of the process they're going to think about it and like hear what they have to say. Just hashing it out with someone like, hey, I didn't think about that. That's great. And maybe that's the one nugget that I got, that just talking it out with people really helps the understanding more and more and more, especially of where everyone else is coming from on a topic.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely think that a weakness some fantasy players probably have is thinking that they're the smartest person in the room at all times. And at least for me, that's rarely the case. So I am always listening to, Drew and Mike and whoever else, to try to pick up on things that I would have overlooked or not thought of.
Mike actually once told me, it was on like a baseball DFS preview show kind of thing, that the most essential thing you could have in daily fantasy is just knowing what you don't know and then listening to people who do know about that.
Yeah.
And then fill in the gaps in between.
It's also like the stuff you guys do at Fantasy National, like, it's not perfect because maybe it can't factor in European Tour data because they don't have strokes gain stats.
Yep.
But you know that, and because you know that product so well, you're comfortable and you can kind of know where, like, oh, that guy might be off a little bit because he plays on the European Tour, and you can kind of take that into account. So a lot of times I think having like a imperfect model that you know really well is better than having one that might be a little bit better, but you don't know it.
Yeah, you think is perfect, but don't quite know where the flaws are yet.
Yeah, like Patrick Cantlay, took forever to pop in our projections for a period of time, and now he finally has because there's data there. But at least when you're comfortable with the model, you're like, okay, Cantlay's still not going to pop this week, but like I just need to manually adjust for that.
Yeah, I know that he's getting closer, and eventually it will reflect that. But I want to be ahead of the curve on this. When it comes to actually playing your lineups, like, are you a volume player? Are you a higher stakes player, a 3-max type player, or does it depend on the night, what you're feeling, and how much time that you have?
I'm definitely more of a 3-max player, or at least as far as lineups. Like for golf, I might put together 20 lineups. I might put together 20 lineups, but I'll play them across all the different 3-maxes, and then I might put 1 or 2 into like the $400 pressure putt or something like that.
So when you're building lineups like that, one of the things that I've really struggled with a lot, because I'm not playing super high stakes, is if I'm playing a 3-max, let's say I max out the $4, and it doesn't matter what sport it is, it could be football as well. I max out the $3 20 max entry one, and I do want to play it in other tournaments, like a 3-max $20 entry or $50 entry kind of thing. How do I know which lineups to take and put into those?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a tough one.
Is that just like, luck of the draw?
I mean, I think you figure in the long run that kind of comes out differently. I think for that, like what I usually do is like the higher stakes lineups, I put a lot more, they're a lot more like thoughtful as far as how I've been putting them together. The ones that are in the lower stakes stuff is more like projection oriented and, driven by like the tools. And I kind of just trust the data that went into them, and I might tweak them manually, but you're kind of putting them together with more of a systemic approach, whereas like the higher stakes ones, putting a little bit more thought. Like for golf, the ownership gets more concentrated as you go like up in stakes, and like you get smaller field sizes. So I think you would think about that differently than you might like a lower stakes contest.
When you play like 3-max or single entry, is there a certain threshold depending on the sport that you're playing, where if a player is going to hit a certain percentage, like you just X him out, be like, no thanks, I'll take the chance that this isn't his night and I win if that's not the case?
As far as like the ownership?
Yeah, let's think about it. Like, I don't know what the chalk line really would be in terms of high stakes hockey ownership, and in terms of like high stakes golf ownership. If in a high stakes tournament, let's say a $400 buy-in, there's like 100 people in it, just as an example.
Yeah.
And Dustin Johnson is going to be 60% owned. Does it ever make sense to play the 60% owned Dustin Johnson?
Yeah, so it always depends on like the pivots and what else is available at the same price point. But I actually got into this argument in our like Slack chat the other week because DJ and Rory, like I think DJ was projected to be 2 to 3 times more owned than Rory,
and it actually came in like 4 to 5 times more owned.
But in the head-to-head markets, DJ was only 2 to 1 as far as like I think he was minus 200 versus Rory. So it's like, hey, in DFS you're getting like hold the rest of your golfers equal. Just assume they're all going to do well. Like you're going to get like 5 to 1 on Rory. But head-to-head, it's saying it's only 2 to 1. So like it feels like even though DJ, well, he had a bad week, but I think he still beat him by a stroke.
Yeah.
But the right play was definitely playing Rory over DJ, and I don't think it's
Well, do you think that's because when people retroactively look at it, they look at how they did that week kind of
Absolutely.
thing? And they're not thinking about how, especially in something like golf, where if you're playing hockey, if you're playing baseball, or if you're playing basketball, stuff is happening every night. So you can look back at 2 weeks and you have 14 isolated events to see how you've done. In golf, you don't get to 14 events till basically the Masters. If you've been playing every single week, that's 4 months worth of stuff. And people react so much to 1 week. Hey, it didn't work this week, so I'm abandoning that strategy. Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get away from. It's even for myself, knowing that's an issue, it's still hard to get away from. But like golf, like you almost need a year to look at to really know, and like sticking to a process for a year before you're like, oh, is that a good or bad process?
I don't got time for that, though.
I don't have time for it. So I'm going to make all my decisions based on what went wrong last week. And that's what people do. Like hockey, like I've never had a losing season, but I lost money in January. And that's over a full month, like playing every night, 30 days basically. And you can still lose over that period of time. So people are making changing their approach to golf. Like they're, MMEing 20 teams 1 week. And if they don't do well, it's like, I need to go to single entry. And then maybe they do all that. They do that for 2 weeks. Then they have a bad week. And they're like, I think I need to go back to MME. And I just think people are jumping all over the place. And that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make because there's a lot of variance. And if you're also varying how you're doing things, it's going to,
Well, you're going to have no idea what's actually working and what's actually successful and what's actually negative. Because you can lose at something, but have the right process. And over time that's going to work out for you. If you don't ever give that a chance to actually play itself out, then you're just never going to win.
Yeah,
and that's probably the biggest mistake that people make.
And entering contests too, sometimes there will be a contest with, the same contest will have $10,000 for first place. The next week it might have the same exact structure, but it has $5,000 for first place, and it spreads out the payouts elsewhere. Well, the person who wins during week 2 is going to feel like they're a worse player than the person who won in week 1, even though they both approach things the exact same way. So that's one of the things that I think can be frustrating is when you do really well, but it's on the week where it's not a top heavy prize pool, or you do poorly and it's not the flat week or whatever.
So when we think about you start writing, you're doing projections, when did the first podcast come in?
I guess last year we started to do some of the golf podcast stuff.
So about a year ago. So I mean, even talk about a little bit about getting into golf as it stands. You got into DraftKings and Draft Street because of football, transitioned into hockey. How does golf come up in any of this?
It was another it was a sport that I liked, a sport that I played growing up, and a sport where people weren't really doing projections or working with data. So a lot of, you think back years ago when DFS golf first started, people just weren't even familiar with who European Tour players were. So they would come over and they'd be 2% owned.
And they'd be just top 10 players in the world.
Yeah, just because they're I don't know who, Tommy Fleetwood is. And
now, I don't know who Nicholas Colsart is.
Now everyone knows those guys. So it's changed a lot. But getting into golf, what drove it was I don't think people are, doing projections and thinking about things from a statistical perspective. Both golf and hockey as an industry feel like they're 20 years behind MLB and NBA. So you kind of see that as an opportunity where maybe you can make more money in those sports because MLB advanced stats are a pretty well-known thing at this point, and they do a really good job with them.
So do you think it was important for you in the success that you've had so far in sticking in the industry and getting a job in the industry? Hockey, golf, not two of the biggest sports going, but two very niche sports where people are demanding good content from it. There was a lack of good content in that space. Because I feel golf is, I built my career on being able to do football, but really, and golf was a big part of that as well, but being good at video is really what helped me progress up the ladder because it was an under-tapped market. People just weren't good at video. So I jump in, I have a good camera, I know how to edit something, and all of a sudden I'm one of the better video people in the space. And if you do golf, it was kind of the same thing. No one was doing golf, so I was doing golf, but not seriously. And then I started taking it very seriously, and then all of a sudden I got to have a good foothold in golf. I see things like MMA, like hockey, even DFS soccer for that. If you can be big in one of these niche things and do it really well, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to get noticed as a writer and to have appeal to sites that might not cover that sport because the people who founded the sites or the people who work there just don't play it themselves. So
they do football and they do baseball.
Yeah, or basketball or whatever.
Even basketball is on the rise, but there's still very few basketball people in the like old fantasy community. It's all, hey, football season's just ended. We're into baseball until football starts again.
So I think like the niche stuff can help. I mean, I think with my role, like the appeal to bring me on to help with the marketing
is business
was
stuff.
more like business oriented.
But
But
I mean,
the
just
fact that I knew like the players,
But just
so
about you
well-
as a fantasy person, like being able to write hockey seems like it kind of differentiated you from the 10,000 other people that are trying to write football articles every week.
Yeah, absolutely. And then because I wrote about hockey and like they were comfortable enough with my writing style and my like success as a player, like I was able to like take some of that and turn it into writing football content for them. And so like I kind of had my foot in the door from hockey and worked with them on golf. But then when the NFL season came along, they're like, hey, we have an interesting idea for a series of articles. Like, would you be interested in writing that? So even though like I'm like self-professed not the best at projecting football, like I am a good fantasy football player because I can like lean on our tools and I can think about how a customer might want to do the same thing.
So being involved with Daily Roto and Sports Grid right now in terms of business and marketing and that kind of thing, do you see any similarities between this and what you used to do? Or do you see it like as a sort of brand new frontier of, hey, there's not really an established market for any of this stuff because daily fantasy is still so new that there's a tremendous upside or a completely different way that we can think about this?
Yeah, so there's definitely some similarities between between Living Social and what I'm doing at like Sports Grid and Daily Roto. I think there's a lot of similarities between the path that Living Social and Groupon went down and the path that like DraftKings and FanDuel have went down, just from perspective of being like really well-funded startups that had like explosive growth, raised massive investment rounds, and were really hyped by the media, and then ended up like either plateauing or not maybe getting to like the level of hype that the media was kind of projecting for the businesses. And the businesses never really changed. Like the market was what dictated the value and the amount of money that they raised. The businesses never really changed. Like things were probably never as good as they seem. They're definitely not as bad as they seem. And a lot of the, I think the success like DraftKings has had is, on the marketing side of thing and their ability to acquire customers, but also the product stuff that they've built. And they've made it like a really easy product to play as a player versus a challenging one. And I think that was one of the areas that Groupon ended up kind of surpassing, or they were the first mover. But one of the reasons that we couldn't surpass Groupon was just that like the simplicity and all the work they put into the product was really strong.
Yeah, and I mean, that even harkens back to what I was talking about before with Fantasy National. One of the things that we really wanted to do with it was make it easy to use. If I didn't know anything about this, could I still kind of figure it out? And I feel like people can.
Yeah, and I think the like mobile is definitely like a mobile first strategy is definitely something that DraftKings seems to have done an excellent job with. I think it's something that you at Fantasy National, I think you guys have talked about, is like wanting everything to be very friendly on mobile. And that was another thing that when Groupon bought Living Social, that I was blown away by how much better their mobile numbers were than Living Social's. And you could tell that a lot of the work that they had put into mobile was another thing that kind of led to them just kind of crushing us from like a performance perspective.
But that takes a lot of forward thinking too, because when they were implementing those mobile first strategies, or at least being able to work on some sort of mobile platform, means they had to be like 2 years ahead of when people were just going to be on their phones 24 hours a day. So is there the next version of that, or have we plateaued? Like, I don't ever want to say that we've plateaued in terms of technology, but did we advance so fast that we're now at a point where the increase is going to be very, very slowly incremental instead of the big boom that we saw?
Yeah, I don't know. It's definitely an interesting question. I think you're always going to end up seeing changes. Like, I don't know what the next, like
if you did, you wouldn't be sitting here talking to me.
Right? Like, I'd get a $1 million job somewhere. But I mean, I think you see it always with the different demographics as far as social channels. Like Snapchat is not something that I use very frequently.
But fewer and fewer people are starting to use it now too, because Instagram basically copied what they did and people just use it on Instagram.
But I think like the younger demos are still like not on Facebook. Like Facebook is for 30-years-olds and moms, and like so.
It's for
like,
me.
Yeah, it's for me too, right? But the younger demos will always find something, and like you're always going to want to be connecting with them even when you're no longer, their age.
But is there a point where it becomes oversaturation where you just can't think about every single thing? At that point, would you almost be better off getting out of the content industry and getting into the distribution industry, being like, hey, if I upload it to this one place, it'll hit every single platform?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely something that's valuable. You've seen that with, being able to record live stuff that automatically gets pushed to different channels and produced into like on-demand files.
Yeah, it's like if we hit a switch, it's complicated to do, and we're not the best at it. But like if we hit a certain switch, we can go live to Facebook, we can go live to Periscope, we can go live to YouTube, all at the same time in terms of video content. But I don't think Snapchat's available on that.
Yeah, it's probably not. But I think that that's definitely like an interesting place to be in the space. And obviously there are some companies that have tried to do it for managing multiple Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts and things like that. I feel like Snapchat hasn't been integrated well, but eventually it feels like something that there would be a value to someone adding that to their product.
Well, the hardest thing would be, I'm not super familiar with Snapchat. It doesn't seem like you are either, but like
the length of the clips, right?
Can you sell things on it? Because until you can sell things on any sort of these social platforms, like Twitter will always have cachet because news breaks on Twitter. People use that as a first response to, hey, here's what's going on. But Twitter is also a marketing platform for everything else. Instagram, how many Instagram ads come up in your Instagram feed? Even just from random people that you follow, they're using Instagram as a platform to sell things. Facebook is kind of the same way, but you have ads and they will push you to different things. Does Snapchat work that way?
I think it would work so I think from Snapchat's perspective, like they changed like the feed, so they have a place where it's a little more story oriented, where like media companies and publishers for like the Olympics, right, are pushing their content. So sure, there is a financial arrangement for all that stuff. And I think for like the content creators, like I guess it's right now it's something that seems like there's not like an easy way to monetize, but it still is like a place that you would want to have content as far as like building a brand and a following with like in a younger demographic.
So even knowing the market of daily fantasy right now and trying to sell premium subscriptions to season long or daily, or try to get people interested in a 24-hour radio network that they consume on their phone or on their radio, wherever, do you feel like that skews young? Because I feel like it does, but not young. Like,
yeah,
I'm thinking like 25 to 35, not 25 and under. And I could be wrong on that because I think it's really hard to market research this.
Yeah, and just like our numbers is definitely not the super young demographic. I think DraftKings users in general are kind of that mid-20s to mid-40s.
Well, you would need money to do it in the first place. And most people that are 22, as a former 22-year-old who had no money, don't think a lot of 22-year-olds have a ton of money.
Yeah. So it could be like a kind of a low value thing, but I think you'll see like, I don't know, like sponsored like I don't know, beer companies and things like that who definitely go after younger, edgier marketing, kind of having like promoted types of content in those channels.
Well, it's funny. When I first started at Fantasy Sports Network, I remember going to Chicago on a sales meeting to try to sell Miller on sponsoring my show or potentially some other segments. And just even at the time, and this was probably like 5 years ago, the people that we were meeting with at Miller they wanted to be like, hey, this is a TV channel. We can sell commercials on. I was like, that's not really, that's what one of the salesmen was there. Like, I can integrate your product into the show. And they're like, well, what channel is it on? It's like, it'll be on the fantasy channel, but it'll also be online. It'll also be distributed through podcasts. And we can weave it all into the same thing. You'll get far more purchasing power for your dollar by sponsoring something like this for less cost than like buying a TV commercial. And they were just like, nah, I don't know about that. That seems crazy to me.
Yeah, and I think part of it is,
and now it seems like it's coming around a little bit more that people are like, oh, if you advertise on podcasts, like who doesn't know about Casper mattresses?
Yeah. So like part of it is I think for some of those is like they have a lot of money they're trying to spend, and like it's a lot of work.
And if they don't
cut it up into small little chunks,
and if they don't spend their money, they don't get that money the next year either.
So it's like, oh, I'm going to spend $1 million this month on marketing, or $10 million on marketing this month, and I want to do it kind of in a profitable way for sure, because otherwise I'll lose my job. But I want to do it in an easy way too. Like I don't want to have to work with thousands of different vendors to advertise on every kind of like small podcast or something. I would rather go find one big podcast or a network of podcasts where I can kind of purchase like a bigger piece of my spend, because otherwise it's just gonna be a ton of work trying to figure out how to spend it all. So I think sometimes advertisers end up going that way, but we have like definitely had success from like an advertising perspective, either direct or indirect with like doing stuff with content creators. Like obviously when Drew or somebody comes on your show, they're doing it because they want to be a guest and they want to
promote the product.
They want to promote the product too, and that stuff is successful. And we've done stuff with a golf podcast where it was more of a direct advertisement or agreement, and like that stuff has been successful. So I think one of the best things is we do have kind of like a niche audience and in fantasy as far as what people are doing and what they're like, and they share a lot of things in common as far as their demographics and background. And so if you have products that hit that,
we can be real about this. The daily fantasy template type person is white guy, sits in front of a computer all day for his job. He is a big part of that over she.
Yeah.
And they do well. They have disposable income.
They have disposable income, so they can lose and it's still fun and entertaining, or they can win and they have more disposable income. But yeah, that's the profile. So if you have a product that you're trying to go after that niche, then like these platforms are really valuable.
The last thing I want to ask you about is in terms of what you talk about. I know so much of this is personality driven in terms of media, in terms of video, in terms of podcasts. But generally speaking, the media, as we see from the media and people criticizing the media, is that journalists, unless it's a dedicated left-wing, right-wing thing, I would say the majority of people in multimedia lean left. That it's just the way that it's always been. It's the way that it's always going to be. Are you surprised that there's not more sports content directed, fantasy sports content directed at sort of like red state type values? Because it doesn't seem like there's any.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely.
I feel like that's a market that no one's in. Like, it's not my market that I'm going to actively go after, but I feel like some people alienate some of those people by what they talk about in their podcast.
They certainly could. Like, I would say the tour junkies do a decent job at connecting with broader, at least in the U.S., a broader geographic base.
And weirdly, being Canadian, I actually try to do that too. Like, there's certain stuff that I just don't want to talk about, or I don't have enough of a strong feeling on that. Like, I want to tell you. Like, that's why I have Tim on. And people can either agree with Tim or disagree with Tim, but he's got hot, polarizing takes on either side, and no one takes him too seriously when they agree with him. He's a real smart guy. When they disagree, he's just an insane person.
Yeah.
So it works out that way. But tour junkies do a really good job. I know for like Fox Sports, like Clay Travis does a really good job of this. I know people don't like him. And I don't.
But that's people like that.
But
that
like
that might lean left, right? They don't like him.
It is, yeah, exactly. But like, it seems like in the daily fantasy space, in the fantasy space in general, that there's not a geared focus towards that, and I think that's an undertapped market.
Yeah, I think that could be an undertapped market. I think that if there was like content that pushed the boundaries a little bit and leaned that way, I think it would probably be well received. I think
it would be very poorly received by some people.
By some, it's not you'd alienate a lot of people. It's not a fit for like my personality. It's not a fit for like Drew's personality.
It would need to be the right person, because it's not something you would ever want to fake. If you started faking something like that, it would be exposed as very disingenuous very quickly.
And I think like Tommy G, I think connects with a different demographic.
Yeah, absolutely, he does.
And he's like outspokenly conservative and talks about it on Twitter and everything. And I definitely think that they do a good job capturing some of that clientele that, that loves his style, because he's definitely one of the more outspoken personalities.
It's weird because Tommy can be political and talk about every issue that comes up, but I don't think it's necessarily his politics that attract people. I think it's his bashfulness, and people respond to. There's a certain type of person, and I'm included in that is drawn to that type of personality.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like, it also depends if you're doing stuff for like the quality of information or you're doing it for entertainment. But like, if I'm sitting on a podcast, like, I'm not going to be the most entertaining guest out there. I'm not going to be super outspoken. You're not going to get any hot takes. But sometimes that stuff's good, and like that's one of the reasons Barstool has been so successful and like really like blown up over the past 5 years, is just like bringing on really strong personalities and having kind of outlandish takes and passionate takes about everything they talk about, whether or not people are getting pissed off or whether or not people love it.
It doesn't really matter as long as they click on it.
Yeah.
It's like the people that tell me they hate me. It's like, I never miss your show. I hate it so much. It's like, I really don't care. Just download it. Like, it's not good.
I can't stand Mayo, but I can't turn him off either.
Yeah, it's as long as you're downloading and clicking on the stuff and watching it for more than 5 seconds, and it's a big win for me.
Yeah, so that's definitely interesting, and I definitely think that from a personality perspective, Tommy's probably the one that I can think of that does it best, along with the tour junkies, as far as connecting to not just the kind of PC left side of the band.
Yeah, I know. I absolutely agree. I mean, I would like to venture more into that because I feel like that's what my personality is more like in real life. But I feel like the older I get, the less I'm like that anymore. If I had my show at 20, it would have been the most outrageous show, saying the most outrageous, controversial things. And now that I'm just older, I don't care anymore. Like, I've just developed so much apathy towards everything that just hot take, cold take. I'll have my personal takes on golfers and football players. But outside of that, like, if stuff doesn't personally affect me, I really don't care anymore.
Yeah. And a lot of times for me, like, fantasy's escape. Like, it's my job, but it's also, something that is fun to think about, like, versus everything else going on in the world, which is, like, stressful. And so a lot of times, like, I don't want to interject my opinion on other issues just because people don't really give a shit about my opinion on it.
People, don't care unless you agree with them because they'll just be triggered if you don't agree with them. And that's all we see on social media anyway. And, like, it's weird with my Twitter feed. Like, I tweet a lot, obviously. A lot of it's marketing stuff, too, and just thinking about that, of getting, hey, this is my show. Watch my show. Watch my show. You tell people enough, they're eventually going to click on it once. And maybe you hook one of 100, and boom, you have a new follower, a new subscriber, a new reader, whatever it is. But I don't like to bum people out on Twitter either. Like, I don't like to get into Twitter feuds with people. Hey, I don't want to say I'm the world's busiest person, but I don't have a ton of time to start Twitter fights with people. And I don't think it's a good look. When I see other people, like, in media start fighting with each other over really petty things, I think it's a really bad look for both of them.
Yeah, I definitely think it is too.
And you can get
and it's happened to me. Don't get me wrong.
It's happened to me too. And I go back and I read it afterwards, like, I look like a fucking moron.
Yeah, you're like, I look like a total jackass. Like, to anybody who doesn't know me, maybe if the people who know me super well, which is usually how you're thinking at the time, is like they're going to understand why you're saying this or why you're acting that way.
But people don't know you.
95% of people don't really know you. And they don't read all your tweets. They just read the ones that, now all of a sudden have 100,000 impressions or whatever.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've probably only been in like 2 or 3, but they just kind of happen.
Hey, to steal a business and DFS term, it's minus EV. It's never a good play.
Although I will say we had a little disagreement, myself and Tommy, and last football season.
Okay.
We talked about it afterwards, resolved some things, but then we pulled our sales numbers and we both had spikes in sales while that disagreement was going on.
Honestly, that's Tommy's a good one to get into it with if you do really stand on the other side, because he's not backing off.
Yeah.
And he'll make it as loud as possible. And I mean, I don't want to call Tommy a marketing genius by any means, but he has really grasped social media and how to promote not only himself, and he's made himself into a character and a big character, but he's also done it simultaneously at the same time as pushing his product. To be a part of Guru Elite is being part of a brand. And I think there are very few sites that have been able, especially premium products, that have been able to galvanize a single personality along with their product at the same time. And it's not just Tommy. I mean, Tommy's the most vocal one, but Jeff does a really good job. Ray does a really good job. Kevin does a really good job. Jeff does a really good job. But Tommy's sort of like the focal point of that, of like the loudness. And then you trickle it down. The other people are loud too, just not quite as loud.
Yeah, and they've definitely done a good job with that. Especially they had like a big base they could plug into when they launched, but they've definitely done a really good job as far as I don't know all their subscribers, but I feel like I do. I feel like I know what the type of person is who's subscribing is like, and it's not always the type of person who subscribes to Daily Roto. And I think we definitely have like a brand as far as kind of like the thoughtfulness and everything that Drew and Mike put into all the content.
And it's reflective of their personality too, though. But I think that makes sense. One is reflective of Tommy's and Jeff's, and one's reflective of Mike's and yours and Drew's. Like, it's 2 different types of people.
Yeah.
But I like that the content does reflect that, though.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that like that part of it is authentic too. I think there are like, not necessarily in the DFS space, but there are definitely people who produce content that have kind of fake personalities, and it's all just like shtick. But I feel like Tommy and Jeff and all those guys are authentic, and that's kind of.
Oh yeah, listen, I have hung with Tommy. He's what you get. It's great. If that's your person, if you can mesh well with that type of person, every single person I know is exactly alike.
But that's what I would want it to be, right? Like, the worst thing would be meeting him and him, being super soft-spoken and shy and like, what?
It would be strange.
Yeah.
Anyway, Colin, Drew, thank you for being in studio. Tell everyone where they can follow your work and on Twitter.
Yeah, you can find me at DrewB417 on Twitter, and check out all of our work over at dailyroto.com.
All right, thank you very much for being here. I'm Pat Mayo. You can follow me at the PME on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Plus, subscribe to the Pat Mayo Experience wherever you can download podcasts, whether it be iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Podomatic, Audio Boom, Google Play, all of them. Got you. Tune in as well. iHeartRadio. No matter where you can listen to podcasts, you can listen to the Pat Mayo Experience. This was a special process version, getting into the industry, what people do in the industry, and how they actually started playing daily fantasy. Again, I want to thank Colin for being in studio, and subscribe to the video version on the DraftKings YouTube page. I'm Pat Mayo. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!